Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Before we really get into the meat of today's session, which is called EnGendering Climate, Accelerating Gender Innovation Through Climate Finance, I have a very radical challenge for all of you, which is to put your phones away, put your laptops away, and be fully present in this room for the next 50 minutes. Now, again, before we get into the heat of it, and as we maybe welcome a few more stragglers from the other sessions, we will be doing a bit of a get-to-know-you challenge. I think it's always quite useful to know who is sitting amongst us in the audience before we kick off the discussion. So with that, some simple questions to get you started. Who's had a cup of coffee this morning? And if you have, raise your hands. Okay, lots of coffee drinkers in the room. What about dog lovers or cat lovers? Any animal lovers in the room? Okay, lots of animal lovers in the room, unsurprising. What about hard metal music? Any huge fans of hard metal music? Okay, we do have some. We have about four hard metal fans in the room. That's great. That's more than I was expecting. Who's ever lied about their birthday to get a free dessert? Okay, pretty honest bunch, good to know. Who's representing climate change? Who considers themselves a climate expert or a climate practitioner? Okay, most of you in this room, that's unsurprising, we are at a climate conference. Who considers themselves a practitioner of social inclusion or gender? Okay, good. We have a lot of gender and social inclusion people in the room, which is fantastic. Who is from the finance world? Could be part of the banking industry, could be an entrepreneur. Raise your hand. Okay, what about public sector? Any government representatives? Okay, few of you. Civil society, anyone here representing civil society, NGO, grassroots organizations? Okay, excellent. Not so many of you here, so that's interesting to note. So I have the privilege of now actually kicking off the session and getting into the heart of this discussion. And here with us today, I have my colleague, Sudarshan Kanagaraja, who is the Practice Manager for Strategy and Knowledge at the World Bank's Climate Change Group. He will be giving our opening remarks for today. So Sudarshan, please join me on stage.
Good morning. So, I am honored to be one of the few men talking about women. And I see a few of you in the audience as well. I am sure my mother, my sister, my wife, my daughter are proud of me. And I am sure nobody here will say that without them, the world will be just and fair. So, as we kick off this very important session, some of you probably were already in the session on the plenary where we talked about just transition. You cannot have a just transition which is not fair or inclusive or equitable. And in this context, we want to talk today in this panel about gendering climate. I want to extend my appreciation in the beginning to I4C and Climate Investment Fund, with whom we co-organized this session. And a special thank you to the honorable speakers joining us today from USAID and BICS Capital. I am delighted to provide these opening remarks, during which we are going to discuss climate finance and climate action. But we want to zoom in on how we can innovate by using climate finance as a tool to accelerate gender in leadership, to achieve greater gender sensitivity and social inclusion in climate outcomes. This is perhaps an area that has not received much attention in these types of forums in the past. I want to emphasize some critical elements for this setting. To start, why must gender and social inclusion be part of our discussion on climate innovation? There are many aspects. The most recognized dimension is the disproportionate impact climate change has on vulnerable groups, including women and girls. A growing body of evidence tells us that climate change is not neutral in its impacts. Our investments and solutions cannot be neutral either. Secondly, women are vastly underrepresented in climate decision making. In boardrooms, in COPs, in grassroots climate action, in climate science, in venture capital, just 2% of venture capital goes to women-led businesses. Only 34% of members at COP27 were women. How can we take effective climate action if half of the global population is not adequately represented? Investing at the intersection of gender and climate change can promote green, resilient, and an inclusive development. More and more evidence shows that women's participation and leadership in climate action are associated with better governance, better conservation, better outcomes, and even better disaster preparedness. I'm sure many of you know how your mothers and sisters helped you in disaster. In private sector, diversifying corporate boardrooms and C-suites can lead to more robust action on climate change, as well as better climate outcomes, such as CO2 emission reductions. Data also shows that companies with more gender diverse workforce do better in climate risk management, innovation, and problem solving, characteristics that are critical to combating climate crisis. Now, today's session seeks to move beyond scene setting to exploring solutions. We will explore how we in this room, as government representatives, investors, entrepreneurs, members of civil society, can strengthen gender and diversity in leadership to deliver gender and climate co-benefits and actualize more gender-sensitive, low-carbon future. We'll be hearing from USAID on its partnership with Amazon to address gender equities that exist for women in the climate finance ecosystem. We'll be hearing from one of I4C's clients, Big Capital, on clean impact bonds. Finally, we'll learn about the Climate Investment Fund's women-led coal transition grant mechanism under the Accelerated Coal Transition Program. We cannot have just transition without gender sensitivity. We know that low carbon trajectories are not linear. We also know that progress on gender equality has been frustratingly slow. How can we achieve deliberate and tectonic shifts for both simultaneously? I'll leave you with this question. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to engaging in this discussion ahead.
So thank you very much, Sudarshan, for providing those opening remarks. I'm now very thrilled and excited to introduce what we have in store for you today. So we wanted to change things up a little bit. It's the third day of this conference. Everyone is a bit tired. Maybe there's a lot of information going in one ear, out the other. So we're going to change things up. We have an elevator pitch style presentation from each of our speakers here today. They will essentially speak about their innovation or their program for 2 minutes, providing some context for the discussion. The panel discussion will actually try to get a bit deeper into some of the challenges, into some of the bigger questions that surround some of these solutions. So with that, I'm very thrilled to introduce my friend and colleague, Nicole Pitter-Patterson, who is a senior gender and trade expert. She will be taking you through today's moderated panel. So over to you, Nicole.
Great. Thanks, Fran. Hope everybody can hear me. And okay, so that was a drum roll for my pitch. Okay, so I'm going to kick off with the first pitch, and this pitch is with regards to 2X Global. I'm being timed. I have 2 seconds, 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay, so 2X Global is a global industry body for gender lens investing. This came about most recently in terms of the name as a merger between 2X Collaborative and what's known as Gender Smart. And this is based on the mobilization of a significant amount of resources, most recently achieving 16.3 billion of investment from the G7 development finance institutions, philanthropic, and other private capital. The focus, and this is why we're pointing you towards 2X Global, is with regards to their focus on gender smart climate finance and the importance of those investments to deliver climate outcomes and promote gender equality and women's empowerment. We invite you to, I think through the QR code you'd see at the end of the session, to actually have a look at the Gender and Climate Finance Toolkit, which is designed by the stakeholders of 2X Global to help fund managers and stakeholders to apply a gender-smart lens to their climate finance qualified investments, ensuring that those prioritize risks and opportunities along the investment cycle, ensuring that also that this is integrated within the existing portfolios with their investee companies. So I invite you to have a look at what we're doing at 2X Global, and I said we're doing because I'm actually also serving a multiple capacity here as a 2X Global ambassador. So I would like to then turn over to Sashi, who is going to tell us about what her pitch is for USAID.
Great, thank you. And we are not competing Shark Tank style. We're working together as we do. $600 billion was made in 2021 for climate-related investments. Of that, less than 20 billion addressed gender inequalities. And yet 80% of the people burdened by climate change are women. So we know that evidence is there, and it's growing as to why gender inequality should be addressed when we think about climate action. For this reason, USAID has launched the Climate Gender Equity Fund with Amazon in COP27 in order to raise awareness and advocacy and funding for both community-based organizations, women-led businesses, investment vehicles, and activists that are out there trying to raise the voices and include women and girls in order to leverage their talent, their expertise, their experience, their life experiences in order to solve some of these grassroots problems and then bring them up in order for investment through partners like the I4C. We launched this because we realized with this gap, we needed to provide some grants in order to build this pipeline. And this pipeline includes people like I met in Bangkok recently, Maipri Loyen. She's a trained engineer and she works in the natural rubber supply chain. But without her voice in the discussions of the supply chain of rubber, you wouldn't have women farmers being able to come to the table to talk through what could benefit them with the carbon credits. It's because women like her are at the table that then she can bring along upstream farmers. And for this, we need to support this through collaboration and coordination. So we're looking for like-minded stakeholders today, hopefully some of you out there, to work with us in creating change for this purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're turning over to Jeroen from Bix Capital for your pitch.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'm glad to see that there are so many people who are not interested in the future of the carbon market, but are more interested in the future of women in development collaboration. We're an impact fund, and I can assure you impact investing can be boring, just like regular investing can be boring. It's often about fiduciary responsibility for putting your money away on behalf of your investors in a sound and economically viable way. But at some point in my life, very early on, when we were establishing Bix Capital, I had an epiphany moment when we invested in a company in Kenya that was selling cook stoves to rural populations, and we provided our capital on the basis that these cook stoves will then generate carbon credits, the company will earn the income from the carbon credits, and they will use that to repay us. But we actually went with a few investors, we went into a village to see what was happening there. And we found the women in the village being very, very happy. And why were they so happy? They weren't per se happy because now they are cooking in clean kitchens, which is a huge benefit from having modern cooking solutions. The most pleased they were about the fact that they had less time to spend on collecting firewood, going into the forest, and spending dangerous trips on a daily basis, and actually stay home and stay in the village. And the women giggled when they told me, now we see the lazy bum husbands sitting around all day, and now we're in the village, and we can kick them around and make them do things. That for me was an epiphany moment to realize that yes, Bix Capital is really about mobilizing climate impact, but it's about so much more. So as you can see in the slide on screen, now that we're setting up Bix 2, we actually realize we have 3 investment lenses. It's still about climate, it is certainly also about the gender impact, and it's also the third lens about the health impact that we can generate from our investments. And we try to identify the impact, we measure it, we try to certify it, and ultimately we valorize the impact and try to monetize it, because through the monetization we can actually scale up the businesses that we're investing in.
Thank you for that very much, Jeroen. And I think we can see clearly in terms of how your interventions are actually working to support women as change agents. I'd like to invite Neha Sharma from the Climate Investment Funds to share her initiative.
Thank you, and thanks very much to I4C for inviting the Climate Investment Funds here today. I will be speaking about the work that the Climate Investment Funds Gender and Social Inclusion team does. The lead for that unit, Nina Kolibashkina, couldn't be here today, so I'm representing that work, and I hope I'm able to do it justice. But just to start, I wanted to introduce the Climate Investment Funds to you. The CIF, or the Climate Investment Funds, is a multilateral fund. It has committed capital of over $11 billion, and it uses a programmatic approach to have country-led investment plans and projects that are implemented by multilateral development banks. So the MDBs are really the implementing arm of the climate investment funds. We have over 400 projects in over 70 countries, so it's quite a large fund, one of the largest in the world. And we have recently launched new programs. So we have programs spanning the mitigation and adaptation domain, and we've recently launched a program to accelerate the coal transition. So it's called ACT, Accelerated Coal Transition. And the intention of the ACT and what the motivation that it really captures is a just transition. So it has 3 pillars. It has a people pillar, a governance pillar, and an infrastructure pillar. So really the just transition is inherent in the way our ACT program is being implemented. And Walcott, which is what I'll speak mostly about today, is a grant mechanism that is about giving direct finance to communities and organizations that work on women's rights so that women can be directly engaged in decisions that will impact them the most in this coal transition. So it's really fostering women climate leadership, and it's giving them grants so that their priorities can become a priority for as investments are implemented. The picture that you see here is from a workshop that happened last week in Mpumalanga, which is the area in South Africa, the province where a majority of the coal mines are located. And what you see here are women from that province, along with the provincial government, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, and the climate investment funds coming together to discuss their priorities, to really understand how what's happening in that region will impact women and give them a voice with provincial, local, and national government stakeholders. So I'm quite excited to speak about this, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Excellent. Well, that's what we would call hot off the presses, right, Neha? Just happening last week. Thank you very much for that. And I'm sure that from all the pitches that everybody has done, that has really piqued the interest of our participants, both those here and those watching us virtually. So I have an opening question, which I'm going to point to Sashi, which is, what are the key challenges or market gaps that your fund, the USAID fund, is seeking to address?
So we understand that right now the pipeline for investors like BIX Capital, like IFC, like the CIF, unfortunately, when it comes to addressing gender equality, inequality, and with women-led businesses, is not huge. We recognize in order for that pipeline to grow, we have to start with the very not low-hanging fruit and the hard-to-reach fruit. Yeah. So we've decided to invest our resources into really early stage business accelerators, enterprises that can be led by men but employ women, to test out different strategies for make it easier for gender-responsive approaches. So it can be anything from a community-based organization to an enterprise to even perhaps an investment vehicle that would be reaching this early stage. And it's through grants.
Excellent, excellent. My next, that same question is posed to you, Jeroen.
Yeah, so
the market.
Again, the real hard work in reaching these women and improving their livelihoods is done by the social enterprise, the social entrepreneurs that are putting their feet in the mud, that go very deep into rural markets, last mile distribution. And in my case, I mean, you talk about products and services, there is other businesses as well. But the truth of the matter is, it's always about those entrepreneurs that are trying to do business in a very difficult circumstances, have to take care of a lot of aspects of doing business right, including sometimes difficult situations around corruption or unstable economies, etc., etc. And still, they are always working with the top of mind of reaching their customers and doing it in the appropriate way. We need to really encourage them to do that. And the best encouragement, I think, is by allowing them access to capital that gives them the flexibility to not only provide those products and services that really are life-changing for underserved populations, by making them more affordable, but also by supporting them to actually reach those customers and staying in the vicinity of the customer after they sold the product. And the after-sales service and the importance of, being there right on the doorstep of a woman who calls because her cook stove broke or because her water purification system doesn't work, and replace it and fix it. I think that's really important, and we need to invest in that. And it's not typically money that can be generated through, let's say, the local banks. And we have to take the angle of really also focusing on the impact and identifying that impact and delivering it to raise these extra types of capital that are not otherwise available for.
Yeah, very, very good point, because what I'm hearing you say also too is that with regards to the consideration of access to finance,
Sure.
access to capital, what you're talking about is affordable finance that then makes it affordable in terms of the solutions actually at the end user stage.
And patience there, I think, as capital.
Exactly, patient capital. Neha, what are some of the market gaps that CIF is seeking to address?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And my work's made really easy because all the speakers before me have highlighted the finance gap in really funding, giving grants to women-led organizations to be able to participate in decision-making that will impact them the most. But just to give a few more shocking numbers, so for example, when we looked at research, we saw that less than 1.5% of climate-focused ODA or overseas development assistance is actually puts women or gender-related issues as a priority in where the finance is going. And of that, less than 0.2% is actually going to women-led organizations. So the numbers are quite shocking in terms of the dearth of finance needed, the dearth of finance going into this sector and the demands that are really high because the impacts will be so dire. So a lot of what's been said really resonates, and there are even worse numbers to share in that regard. So as I said before, Walcott is really trying to give grants to women-led organizations that are working in the coal transition to give them a voice. But there are a few things that it's more specifically doing. It's fostering women climate leadership through capacity building activities. So workshops like the image that you just saw is about making sure that they have the capacity to engage in these discussions, to tell them how they can hold their governments, local, national, provincial, accountable to their needs. And it's also about piloting activities that would create more job opportunities for them in the future. So piloting activities like green jobs or building their capacity to take on these jobs once there's an opportunity to do so, and participate actively in programs like the ACT. So, that the conversation, the vocabulary, the activities that maybe women don't have a platform to be a part of, provide that platform and then give them the capacity to truly engage. We're also designing and piloting access to finance and training programs so that women-led organizations not only have access to this grant, but are able to access similar grants. And this panel might seem a bit misleading, but IFC has done such a great job of bringing people who are really working in this domain. So don't be misled to think there's lots of capital going to support women. There really isn't. We've just done a good job of bringing those who are working in this area to speak to us today.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Neha. And what I'm hearing also with your focus that you're talking about vis-a-vis fostering women's climate leadership, you're ensuring that at the community level, at the grassroots level, which is also what I'm hearing from Jeroen and as some of the focus from the work that Sashi at USAID is doing. So I'm going to point a question to you now, Jeroen, in terms of quantifying and monetizing health and gender benefits to generate additional cash flow. That is actually a very innovative approach in terms of the three components that you showed us that you're doing. We know that that's very challenging, especially when we consider all of the issues in the carbon markets. What would you tell the skeptics? So you have a whole audience to convert with not much time.
No, so okay. In a very short way, I think it's an amazing opportunity to actually convert impact that's already happening from interventions that are taking place into something that becomes tangible and monetizable, and therefore further strengthens the ecosystem that we're investing in. And so in itself, once it works, it's an accelerator for scale. That's the good news. The not so good news is that, of course, if you look at the carbon markets, there is a lot of skepticism about around its integrity. I think I would like to add something to that which is really important for our fund, is that also the benefit sharing from that carbon revenue, the monetized carbon revenue, how is that done within an ecosystem that you're financing? If you are purely benefiting as an entrepreneur and put the money in your pocket, that is very different from looking at a way of distributing that benefit that comes into the ecosystem to the end users and the women particularly. And we see some very good examples of actually cash going back to women cooperatives who jointly run cook stoves in their homes, and they can use the cash to either make loans to each other or whatever they prefer to do. And so the benefit share, I think, is also something we can take, and this is a big topic right now in the carbon markets as well. And finally, of course, it's also about the intention of the buyer, but let's the buyer put that aside for the moment, because I think this is the biggest challenge we face, is that, where do we find people that are willing to pay for unitized outcomes specifically addressed to women and health, for example. I mean, this is difficult, yeah, but we do baby steps to get there. And I think the infrastructure of the carbon market, also with the third-party validation and an overarching role for, let's say, a UN, et cetera, all those things we can learn from and adapt in order to make a scalable opportunity in this type of monetizing.
Right, because it's important to achieve that level of scale. Coming back to you, Sashi, and speaking a little more about USAID's initiative, can you share with us why USAID, their approach has opted for a grant-based fund approach as opposed to an investment approach?
Yeah, so we are looking to to leverage our $6 million from Amazon and USAID to raise $60 million in 3 years for this purpose. And the reason is that through our work in agriculture and energy programs and water programs across the world, over and over again, we find that women are the change agents. They're the first movers to adopt new practices in agriculture, to look at energy efficiency as a tool for changing their use of fuel from charcoal to as a resource, and reducing waste. And so knowing that there are change agents and knowing that with women in leadership, in business and in government, that you actually have more ratification of environmental agreements and land use policies being reformed, we felt that grants were critical. And we have very limited resources. We do work in blended finance, but in this space, it's not ready yet, in our opinion, to bring this force of really nature to the forefront for investors, right? I'm sure you can speak to this. So we want to spend some time in the next few years building that pipeline. And hopefully, along with our work, we'll bring investors to the table to then be able to look at the growth of opportunities in this space. But yeah, we decided to go with what's harder with grants and then hopefully be able to move into the investment space.
But you also said that before, when we were speaking earlier today, that allows opportunity in terms of the capacity building that needs to be done, correct?
Exactly. And for one example, I'll give you, many of the GCF directed access entities must do a GESI analysis to be able to complete, the checkbox of going through the GCF process. And we found that some organizations just don't have the capacity and time to do this complete analysis. So a simple grant to an entity to be able to complete their GESI analysis could be the difference between a 6-month gap in being able to complete. So it doesn't cost a lot. They just need the funding to hire the consultant to help them do the GESI analysis and build it into their application. And we've found that to be a toolkit that can be useful for many direct access entities. So that's just one example of why we would choose to pursue this as a grant.
And I'm sure an important part of that also is in terms of the technical assistance support that comes with that as well, so that you're ensuring that the knowledge transfer is actually taking place. So Neha, we've heard you speak about the excitement in terms of ACT and Walcott. When we think of the coal transitions, we tend to think of men losing out on fossil fuel dependent jobs, which is a very real situation, I'm sure, very much so in South Africa. And other parts of the world. Why is it important to consider women in coal transitions? You spoke a little about that, but if you can share a little more, and also what you see as the opportunities for them.
Yeah, thanks. And as you said, when you think of coal transition, you think of men working in mines. But a lot of, what we're referring to, or the vision we're getting, is formal labor associated with coal mining. And that's true. A majority of the formal labor is men. But when you look at the informal sector that's supported by coal, a majority, a disproportionately high number of those are women. And they're working in the most unsafe jobs with the least amount of security, and are the most vulnerable to any transition that takes place. I mean, I'm from India, and I've witnessed women in Jharkhand and Orissa gathering coal from abandoned mines. And that's one of the most dangerous jobs, informal jobs that you could do. It's the men that take the coal to the market, but it's the women that go down those mines and gather, remaining coal there. So women are in the informal sector associated with coal are doing some of the most unsafe jobs with the least protection. and they're invisible because they're not formal numbers that are counted, but they're so vulnerable. Another aspect is there's study after study that shows that if men are unemployed, it reduces the status of their domestic partners at home. It increases gender-based violence, it increases food insecurity for women, and it generally reduces their household status. And so as men lose jobs, then they might be coming from the formal sector, but they're going to have dire implications on the household and on the women in these households. The third reason here is that, like I was saying before, the voice of women is just not heard. There are not a lot of platforms, and there are more barriers to entry for women engaging in policy conversations and decision-making that will impact directly their lives. So I want to think, we should think about women when we think about coal as well, because they're an important part of this transition story and need to be cared for. And you also asked about opportunities, and when we looked at just transition at the SIF, we saw just transition as a moral responsibility, but also an opportunity. And the framework that we have on just transitions, I'm not going to get into that right now, but one of the elements, in addition to the social inclusion and the distributional analysis piece, is a transformative vision. So, and the transformative vision is really saying, are you going to make changes around the margin, or are you going to use change that's coming as an opportunity to do something drastically, fundamentally different that addresses systems level barriers. And gender has several systemic barriers that need to be addressed. So I think just transition is an opportunity to create more green jobs, including for women and men, but really bring women into the labor force. Study after study shows how that has really good consequences in terms of social indicators on health and education and well-being of children and the household in general. So there will be some positive opportunities on the economic and social side. And I'll just add one more on the political side, because there are also studies that show as women take on more leadership positions in policy and in politics, it has good consequences for social outcomes of national governments as well. So there are lots of opportunities associated with this just transition, and we hope that a program like Walcott is able to amplify the voices of women and result in these impacts.
Right, and you've touched on quite a few dimensions with regards to the health considerations, and lastly, with regards to where women are in leadership, right, within that whole chain. So thank you very much for that. Jeroen, what does success look like for BICS Capital? And how can this innovation, the innovative work that you've been doing, looking at the three dimensions, be scaled and replicated?
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting question. As an investor, you're always keen to explain what success could look like. First of all, I think success is really when you set up a follow-on fund. We've done BICS Capital. We're now setting up a new fund, which will do the same thing, but at a slightly broader scale, and we will explicitly start tapping into underwriting other forms of impact to collateralize than just the climate. So for us, success definitely would look like doing a pure gender deal or a pure health deal or some form of development impact bond that actually encapsulates some of these aspects all in one, and we can be part of that. And I think we can call that success because it helps create robust ecosystems where buyers and implementers and impact managers collaboratively work towards the same objective of scaling those robust ecosystems. But in all fairness, it all starts, with small baby steps. I mean, every investor is looking for a success story. And sometimes the success story can be very small. There is a session afterwards where we will talk about a development impact bond, which is literally only a $300,000 investment in a biogas company in Kenya, which is purely financed based on health and gender. Now, when that works and we do it properly and we think about how to scale that structure up when there is success, I think that's how it starts. But we have to identify lessons learned, we have to redesign, we have to talk about the successes, and then I think gradually, and this is where I really would like to applaud you with the 2X challenge as well, then we have to make sure that we lock ourselves in to these broad platforms of collaborative action around a single issue like gender, where So for example, as BICS2, we are fully adhering to those 2X criteria. And we're also very excited about the idea that there might be certification of those outcomes in the future. I know it's early stage, but these things are very exciting from a global platform perspective.
Right, and I know that the 2X colleagues will be very happy to hear that you're very excited and see a lot of benefit in terms of being part of that network and that work that's happening there. So thank you very much for that plug. And that just reinforces in terms of some of the work that's actually been taking place. I don't know how much you've actually been doing in terms of your work already in terms of applying the Gender and Climate Toolkit. So maybe if you want to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we actually did. We had one of our colleagues go through a workshop with your 2X colleagues. And he's implementing the toolkit for all of our funds. And also, we were a multiple fund manager, so we also at the fund management level, we're implementing that. And of course, again, also baby steps, because it takes time and there are so many other things that we need to do in parallel. But I think it's a very good assessment to get your objectives in terms of gender impact straight and also incorporate them in your daily activities and in your operational manuals, set the targets, set yourself also milestones for meeting those targets.
Yeah.
It's really a helpful tool.
Yeah, I think what's really great to hear from you also to Jeroen is in terms of what you're saying about the baby steps and even in terms of the gender bond, the size that it's starting out at and the opportunity to scale. Because a lot of the time we may be thinking that, well, if you don't have millions or billions, you know, what's the point? But you're talking in that case, an example in terms of hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, Sashi, how will, this is where to say how will you, I know it's how will USAID ensure that money is reaching the most impactful climate sectors in terms of businesses and opportunities on the ground, and simultaneously, of course, driving gender inclusion. Can you share with us some of what you are seeing as what is the goal and what you've seen so far that's pointing in that direction?
Yeah, so I can start by saying we haven't yet started granting, but we will be working with lots of partners. In fact, we're in the process of making the selection for our grants manager. Hopefully we can announce that soon in the next couple of months. And because we know as USAID, we can't do this alone, it'll be our grants manager reaching out to the over 80 plus missions we have globally to then leverage our relationships on the ground. And again, it's not just community-based organizations, it is accelerators, so it could be a fund in Europe, but the criteria we're using to select will be based on different funding rounds, and so it is a little bit contingent on which donors choose to join us in this platform. But then finally, I would say, in order to ensure inclusion and ensure that we're driving impact, we need more evidence. And so I'm excited to learn from colleagues like Neha on how we can use processes to really build bottom-up monitoring. And that'll be an element that we'll incorporate as we go forward.
Right, and I think the thing also in terms of the evidence is actually to be sharing as we are developing and finalizing what those solutions are. And that points me right back to you, Neha. SIF aims to be transformative and catalytic in nature, and it also seeks to engage people at the community level. Can you speak more about what this looks like in practice? And you can relate it also to what Sashi was just discussing.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you know, when I started introducing the SIF, I spoke about SIF's programmatic approach. And the programmatic approach of the SIF necessarily requires that diverse stakeholders work together from the get-go. And when I say diverse stakeholders, I'm also referring to governments and multilateral development banks, private sector, but also CSO, civil society, to be engaged in the process. So when the SIF develops investment plans that are programmatic, we require that MDBs have their own processes that do this, but SIF Investments also requires that we engage with civil society. So that's the way the business model of the SIF is set up. And then within it, there are specific things that are ensuring checks and balances or ensuring active participation. So linking that back to the evidence question, and now putting in a plug for my actual job, which is the evaluation and learning lead at the Climate Investment Funds, we try and develop a lot of knowledge, evidence base, and opportunities for learning, so that successes on how to engage civil society and CSOs, CBOs is actually then shared widely. Like what works, how do you engage them, what type of capacity do they need? We have a very active local stakeholder engagement team at the Climate Investment Funds, and they work a lot on local stakeholder engagement capacity building. So we're partnering with that team at this very next month to do an evaluation capacity building workshop that's focused on SIF observers. And SIF observers sit on our board, they observe our meetings, and they make interventions, they're allowed to ask questions, they're allowed to bring speakers and experts to speak to the board, and they really are the voice of their constituencies in bringing some of that accountability mechanism into the board. And we want to make sure that they're aware of their rights, that they are aware of what just transition is and what it means and what our programs are trying to do, and that they're able to ask the right questions in all the different platforms that we want them to participate in. So there's really a core focus in community engagement and really making sure that local stakeholders, indigenous peoples, and local communities are engaged throughout the investment cycle of the climate investment funds. I'm really looking forward to working together to build more evidence, on this really important topic, and then making sure that it reaches audiences who could use it.
Right, across multiple networks. I think we can safely say watch this space. I don't know, Fran, if we have a chance to be able to take any questions from the floor?
Sure, yeah, I think so. Please, is there a microphone? Here.
And then I'm going to come back to each of my speakers to ask you for your key takeaways that you want to leave the audience with.
Check. So let's the question to Jeroen, since he's the only male here. And I know your age, but we're kind of redundant by now, over 50. The question to you is, what's the leap in your mindset that you need to make or overcome in order to be successful in your intention of the BICS fund? So there's a thing that needs to be accomplished that you're not yet at. So what is that?
Well, that allows for an elaborate answer and a short answer. Let me try to do the short one. I think there is two things. We did a lot of things in BICS Capital in an implicit way, and we were able to ex post identify the impact that our investments had. For BICS Capital, for BICS 2, we're making that much more explicit. We're building it into our investment process to do an assessment of every potential investment in terms of the total impact potential, how the benefit is shared, at what time it's shared. So this whole assessment of really being more stringent on what we're going to report about impact is one objective. The second objective for success is really moving away from purely pre-financing carbon and making sure that we tap into the early opportunity of also underwriting other forms of monetized impact, like gender, like health, like educational, for example, which is another angle we haven't really talked about. That's very challenging because there is no real market for this, and there is no real understanding on how we scale interest from the buy side for these kind of impacts. But that would be sort of the real strategic objective to achieve.
Oh.
Investors, I sense for any investor, it's just one second. It's interesting to look at cases where there are no business cases yet. And it's about sensing. So nature, women's need attention. There is no business case. Go for it.
Well said. Well said. Okay, so it's building the business case and actually validating. I'm hearing that we need to move along, so actually what we're going to do is, for those who have other questions, ask you to still engage with the group. I do want to ask just a few words as a final key takeaways from our panelists. So Sashi, if you can share with us for the participants that we have looking on today.
Sure. I'm going to take this liberally from our administrator, Samantha Power, who says, climate change is sexist. Our response should not be.
Okay, well, I think that says it well. And Neha.
Yeah, just building on that, I guess the key takeaway for me is gender isn't something that's happening in this separate space, you know. Working on gender outcomes is good for climate action, and we've heard so many people say this today. And so Darshan, for example, spoke about how having women leadership in boards means enhanced ESG reporting. There's just so much evidence out there that says good gender outcomes are good for climate action, and that, I think, is the bottom line.
And your final words?
Well, I underwrite what both women are saying.
Well said.
I want to be very humble about that. And I also think it's really about building robust ecosystems around this, which means involving all stakeholders, you rightly mentioned it, but also thinking about where an ecosystem is now and where it will have to go. So there's also a time factor. And I think that's in part playing to looking where there is no business case yet, but
Right, building the business case. Yeah,
approach.
yeah. I think what we've heard very clearly, the message from this panel is that climate action, social inclusion, and gender equality are symbiotic objectives that are more effective when integrated, and the integration must occur at the climate finance allocation stage. So that's where we will leave it for this session, and thanks for your engagement.
Before you leave, before you clap, I just want to say thank you for joining this session. You know, it's great to have a gender session at a climate conference to spark this conversation, this really critical conversation. And you know, something that always strikes me is when we speak about climate, we speak with such a sense of urgency and resolve. It's action today, tomorrow, next month, this year. When we talk about gender inclusion, we literally talk in centuries, 300 years to close gender gaps. So how can we apply the same level of ambition, the same urgency, and the same resolve towards a just transition? This is really a key question. And this is important for two reasons that all of these amazing panelists have spoken about today. One is, of course, from a justice and equity perspective. Including women in climate action is critical from that right alone. The second one is that how can we really have effective and innovative climate solutions with one hand tied behind our backs? Who are we scaling for? Who are we innovating for? So I'll leave it with that question. I'm also leaving it with something a little bit more pragmatic than that question, which is a set of resources that you can use to learn more about this. This is a short list of thematic notes, policy papers. You can get your phone out now. I hope you are now able to turn your phones back on, because I know you all turned them off at the beginning of the session, to download some of these resources and learn more about this. This is the first of many conversations, and I want to thank all of my panelists up on the stage, Sudarshan for providing opening remarks, and also all the people in the back and who's not on stage who enabled this session as well. So thank you very much for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.